Hi, Carl. I see you. Okay, there we go.
Okay, we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. And ladies and gentlemen, when you do come on line, please do mute your mics for now, please. Right, I think we'll make a start now. Christine, are you good to go?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Marissa.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and I hope that you all had a good, short, long weekend. If those of you who took a day off, and otherwise a good public holiday if you only had the one day off. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Christine Mundy, who is a first-year general chemistry lecturer at UP. And I've certainly been working with her. She's in my field, which is chemistry education, and it's very nice to introduce a colleague. Her scholarly approach to teaching is evidenced by her receipt of the Institutional Teaching and Learning Excellence Award, and more recently, the National Saki Chemical Education Medal. She finished her PhD at now more than a year, isn't it?
Yes, 2021.
When going through the COVID pandemic, it's like that time never happened. But she's interested in cognitive load, language demands in learning, and context-based chemistry, which she manages to weave together to make a very good framework, which seems to be very good for the students. And I'm going to hand over to her on making learning meaningful, and I'm going to give her about 40 minutes. So if you have any questions, please note them down, and I'll be calling on you after she's finished. So Christine, please go ahead, and we're looking forward to your talk.
All right, thank you, Marissa, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I'd also like to thank Prof. Ntebogang, the director of the Mamelodi campus, for making space for these virtual seminars and for disseminating them campus-wide. And welcome to you, the audience, to my virtual seminar about making learning meaningful. Okay, so for learning to be meaningful, there are three things which need to coincide: the thinking, the feeling, and the doing. And this is according to Novak's theory of education, which states that meaningful learning underlies the constructive integration of thinking, feeling, and acting. leading to human empowerment for commitment and responsibility. So most of us are pretty good at the cognitive part. We get our students thinking, and some of us get our students doing. But the most important thing here is to get all three going at the same time. One can't just say, I deal with the cognitive in lectures and the psychomotor and practicals. One has to get all three domains of meaningful learning going at the same time in order for the learning itself to be meaningful. And with psychomotor here, I've given a lot of examples because some subjects don't have a practical component, but there are options like computer modeling, virtual reality, field trips, gamification, and games. There's so many ways to make your subject hands-on. So when we're talking about thinking, we need to know how thinking works. And there are various educational theorists which talk about how thinking works, but the model which I prescribe to is the information processing model, which says that you have incoming information over here, which we eventually want to get into the long-term memory. And before that can happen, we have a perception filter, like a sieve through which information passes. Then it is held, processed, and organized before perhaps imparting to the long-term memory. So that's not a guarantee. And what we're really trying to do when we look at information processing is we're trying to package information here. You can see the little juggler juggling concepts. We're trying to package our information in a way that it can be easily held, processed, and organized, and therefore transition to the long-term memory. You can see the little juggler has concepts, and what we call here is they're chunked together. And inside of working memory, in order to help this chunking occur, to help this holding and processing occur, one needs to, as an educator, be aware of cognitive load theory, and that would optimize our learning experience. So extraneous load is something that we as educators want to minimize. That is the noisy load on a slide or a learning material or in a textbook. So too much information, font too small, writing too loud, too many things underlined, too many arrows, for example. Intrinsic load is the inherent difficulty, and as educators, we always want to make the difficulty match the level of the student. And then they have what they call germane load, which is the load associated with scaffolding. So when you give a material, there should be some degree of scaffolding, and what that will do is help the working memory, which will therefore help items go into the long-term memory. So now we've dealt with the cognitive. I'm going to move to the affective. Everyone here is probably quite familiar with Bloom's taxonomy for cognitive learning. He had a second book in which there was a taxonomy for affective learning. And really what's going on with affective learning is that we can get across more sophisticated ideas. Students can change from being listeners to actually changing their characters if we tap into the affective domain. So it starts with students being able to just listen, then engage with the information, then beginning to put information into their knowledge structures, and finally being able to change their behavior. And if we look at the affective domain overlapped with the cognitive domain, we can see that receiving would be of incoming information. Responding would be the willingness to engage with that information. And like I said before, the perception filter, that sieve, helps responses. The more open the sieve, the more information can pass through, the more students can begin to engage. Once they're engaged, they can begin to process. And in that process of internalization and processing, they can begin to value the material that you've given them. If the material is valued, it can then pass into the long-term memory and be organized and stored. If something then gets to that stage within the student's cognitive architecture, we would expect what's going on at the bottom is that there's a feedback loop between the long-term memory and the perception filter. So if we have gone through the correct steps effectively, we can begin to control that feedback loop in terms of actions of the students when they hear incoming information or when they respond to situations. For example, if we were dealing with sustainable development goals, if we'd gotten all the way to organization and long-term memory, we would begin to see students in blue acting as sustainable members of society. So what I've just spoken about in terms of the cognitive and the affective gives an opportunity for academics to enrich their curricula. And it might sound daunting at first, but there are various tools that you can use. One of the UP graduate attributes at the moment is the Sustainable Development Goals. I've used that in some of my curriculum transformation, and that leads to, some of you might have heard of systems thinking, but if you haven't, that's okay. Another opportunity that presents itself in embedding the affective and making students feel is context-based teaching and learning. So here we can really tap into real life contexts, current events on the news and social media, and we can also begin to bring in a little bit of Indigenous knowledge into our curriculum. And when I talk about Indigenous knowledge, which I tapped into a little bit in one of my other examples, we're talking about generational knowledge, not specific to a culture, but knowledge that's passed on from generation to generation. Like I'm going to talk about brewing of beers and how that's African and European and basically worldwide, the idea of brewing of beers in a little bit. Now I'm going to just jump into 3 examples from my research where I've taken the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor, and I've put them together. And the easiest place for a chemist to put all of that together is in the practical laboratory. For you, it might be a completely different situation, like a field trip, like I mentioned, like virtual reality, but for me, it was the laboratory. And this is the laboratory on the extended curriculum program, Mamelodi campus. And my first foray into curriculum transformation was integrating the UN Sustainable Development Goals into a microscale pollution experiment. So we wanted the students to do some self-study first about what the Sustainable Development Goals are. There you can see 17 Sustainable Development Goals in the bottom corner of the screen. And then we wanted students to reflect on the value of integrating the UN Sustainability Goals in the experiment. And I analyzed their report sheets, and we gave them a questionnaire which was voluntary, online, and after the practical. It actually occurred 2 months post-practical because we were really interested to see what is the retention after 2 months. And I think that's a question everyone would like to know about their learning experiences. What do students keep with them after 2 months? So what the experiment was really about, I'm not going in deep into the chemistry, but students made a little factory. So you can see here in blue, here's a little factory. And they did this 3 times over, and the factory produced sulfur dioxide, which when it reacted in the atmosphere and reacted with the water, created sulfuric acid or acid rain. And here you can see when there was no chimney on the factory, there's a lot of acidification in the wells. Here you can see when we added a chimney to the factory, there was less acidification of the wells. And here when we packed our chimney with calcium oxide, there was very, very limited pollution. So the students had researched the UN Sustainable Development Goals on their own, and then at the end of the practical, we asked them to identify and explain the UN Sustainable Development Goals highlighted in this experiment. What we found were very sophisticated answers that weren't just the obvious UN Sustainable Development Goals. Students really went the extra mile into looking at things like infrastructure, etc. So what happened 2 months after the experiment? We could see that 55% of students were able to recall a large amount of relevant sustainable development goals. So like I was saying, responsible consumption, sustainable cities and communities. It wasn't just the obvious ones like life below water and clean water and sanitation. Students really thought out of the box about the impact of such an experiment or such an industry on the world around them. And we also found when we analyzed the students' results is that they understood chemistry concepts better as a result of us embedding the practical in the affective domain. We'd given students context about factories which do produce sulfur dioxide, coal burning factories. So students, it helped them understand the chemistry concepts better, but it also helped them see chemistry in context better. So here this person said, it opened my eyes to how the world is at the current moment and the impact one individual can make on the environment. And then we went on to ask several questions, and the first question of the students was, to what extent do they agree with the statement, I would like to learn more about the UN SDGs? If we look at the responses, overwhelmingly positive. Students want to know more. And then students agreed that doing a lab experiment which included the SDGs made it more meaningful for them. So they're in that retention. And finally, we asked them, do you think it should be a graduate attribute, the UN SDGs? And again, we got an overwhelmingly positive response, showing that our first-year students are happy, if not want to learn more than what is included in the current curriculum. They want to be stretched. Now I'm moving on to one of my most recent research projects. We all remember the COVID-19 pandemic, and we remember all the restrictions placed on us. Cigarettes, alcohol was a big one, and that inspired this practical. So this practical was about bootlegging of alcohol. That's when alcohol is smuggled or made illegally. So that inspired this whole practical, and we wanted to see if we contextualized a practical in the COVID-19 prohibition of alcohol and we brought in Indigenous knowledge, would we be able to actually reach first-year students' expectations of a chemistry practical? And let me first tell you a little bit about the practical. The practical we devised was based on everyday knowledge or everyday myths. The first one was the blue train myth, the idea that filtering methylated spirits through bread will make it drinkable. So we did that experiment in the lab. In the first year, it was an online experiment. In the second year, it was face-to-face. The second experiment was my lab assistant made some pineapple beer. Here you can see unfermented and fermented, and we wanted students to look at the intensive and extensive properties to see if they can tell the difference between fermented and unfermented without tasting it or measuring the alcohol amounts. And then the third one was to actually break down the name of brandy in terms of brandewijn, burnt wine, And we showed them how brandy is actually made in terms of the distillation of red wine into brandy. And in addition to crafting these 3 experiments, we embedded into the report sheet economic, societal, and health questions, as well as information. I'm sure you can all remember the Eyobeni Tavern disaster where many teenagers had methanol poisoning and passed away in the tavern. We also embedded Indigenous knowledge, not just from Africa, but as much as we could throughout the world. We spoke about home brews, and we also inserted some information about mortality. If you can recall on the news, people passing away after making their own pineapple beers, drinking it. So we embedded a heck of a lot into this experiment. And now we wanted to see, did we meet the students' expectations? And in the effective domain, here we can see the pre-effective. This is what students expected, and this is what students experienced. And the y equals x line means that their expectations were met exactly by their experience. So here you can see that the majority of the responses, we met their expectations. You would think that creating a practical such as I've just described to you would wildly overshoot students' expectations, but here you can see the caliber of students that we're dealing with. Students are expecting to be engaged effectively. What they weren't expecting was to be engaged in terms of Indigenous knowledge, and here you can see the majority of students, we surpassed their expectations and made them think about chemistry in real life. However, for some students, we did not meet their expectations, but when we interviewed them, it was more because they were disappointed that sometimes they had to share. It was other reasons that weren't actually related to the contextualized idea of the practical. So now I want to share with you my final piece of research. This is actually the culmination of my PhD study, in which I use design-based research. So for those of you who haven't heard of design-based research, it's very similar to action research, but it relies more heavily on theory, education theory. And for me, my education theory was information processing and cognitive load, like I showed earlier on, how students process information. And I looked at that to identify and address barriers students might have in terms of emission spectroscopy. And in this practical, here you can see a funny shaped little thing. This is a mini spectroscope. It's about the same size and shape as an asthma pump. And students constructed this for themselves with cardboard and a shard of CD. And we got the students to look at various light sources with their mini spectroscopes and look at the spectra created. Along with this, we had a lab report in which we bedded various conceptual questions so that we could track students' understanding. And there was a lot of data collection in this project, from questionnaires to recorded discussions, observations, and student performance. And when I said we relied heavily on theory, what I meant was I would take the information processing model after each round, and I would analyze where barriers were occurring to student learning. So initially, we found that students were battling with a large amount of text. So we changed the text into pictures and examples. And we went through a cycle of this research, and we saw that student performance got better, student understanding got better. And then the next round, we began to find that language began to play a part in terms of intrinsic load. Students couldn't link one word to another word, so we added help to the report sheet to help students with intrinsic load. And finally, with germane load, we saw that students were sometimes constructing incorrect word meanings or muddling word meanings from the same word family. So we embedded scaffolding into the practical to help with that. So we went through multiple iterations, every time referring back to theory to try to enrich the students' learning experience and overcome the barriers that they might be facing. So we got fantastic student performance eventually. We were aware of outdated terminology, for example, discrete. I spoke about word families and students getting confused, especially in the word families of optics. And one very interesting finding from the study was the use of non-technical words, for example, talking about an electron jumping instead of an electron transitioning was actually problematic to students. But we overcame this through the various cycles of design-based research. So what did this mean to students in terms of the affective domain? And we found that students, having built this little mini-spec of their own, really enjoyed the practical, really felt that they learned from the practical, and really found their identity as becoming professionals in the field develop. So there was a lot of pride, etc., in who they were, in looking at light in different ways. And this resulted in a ripple effect that we weren't expecting, and that was that the students took these mini specs home with them. It reached as far afield as Durban. These mini specs were taken throughout the country, and the students explained the authentic science to their family, friends, and communities, sometimes in English, sometimes in their own language, and it had huge value for the community. Here we can see a student reflecting and saying, it was of great value because my little brother is interested in science. Another person said, it opened a window to the world of science as we can observe it. So this again had fantastic impact in terms of the community, but it also had a fantastic impact on the students' sense of identity as scientists. So in this practical, again, we were hitting the cognitive. We spent a lot of time refining the cognitive. The psychomotor was doing the practical, seeing the light sources, and the affective was far more than we could ever have dreamed of, and that our little spectroscopes went all over the country. So, in conclusion, I want to say that these three domains for meaningful learning cannot be held in isolation. When the three come together, we get what is called truly meaningful learning. And for us as academics, this gives us the power to empower students as seeing themselves as professionals in the disciplines, but we also have the ability to begin to craft leaders for the 21st century, especially when we integrate things like context-based learning or sustainability-based learning. So I'm going to close with a plea to my colleagues to make learning meaningful. Do not keep the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor in silos. They need to come together for your students to find meaning in what they're doing. I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd also like to thank the various students over various years who have participated in these studies. I'd like to also thank my colleagues in the chemistry department, my supervisor, my then supervisor, Mariki Potgieter, Michael Siri, who I'm still in collaboration with from the UK, and my lab assistant, Boyce Mello. And if anyone is interested in knowing more about chemistry education research at the University of Pretoria, please scan the QR code. You'll get taken directly to our page where you can find out a little bit more about us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. You've left a lot of time for questions, but I think it was a very well put together talk. And I'm sure some of the non-chemists in the group will also have good questions to ask you. So what I'm doing now is I'm opening up to questions. And if you want to know more, then I'm sure Christine will be able to address some of your questions. So I suggest if you have a question, raise your hand, or otherwise, if you're finding difficulty communicating, you can also type into the chat. So I'm asking now for any people who'd like to ask questions, and I'm looking out for them. Well, Christine, at the moment, there aren't any hands up, but I thought I would ask you a question related to if you use a contextualized teaching approach with the students.
Yes.
What does the literature say about whether learning is better in a contextualized situation, or whether it's the same, or whether it's worse, or whatever? Can you say something about that?
I think one needs to be very careful in that you don't over-contextualize, because if one goes back to that information processing model, if one gives too much information to be processed, then that's going to negatively impact learning. So when you make something context-based, you have to be very careful in the amount of context and the relevancy that you give to that context.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm still waiting to see if anybody's got some questions. Mike Mundy is asking, any relation? Do you think that this method would work at all levels?
I would say definitely. I would say from preschool all the way up to postgraduate, one of the things that we begin to miss is either the heart or the hands. Content is pulled through the curriculum all the way, but little students come in and they are fully able, or they want to engage their feelings, their emotions, and their doing. And so I don't see any reason why this cannot be pulled through to even, well, that's what postgraduate is. So I suppose there's a gap, there's sometimes a gap in undergraduate teaching and sometimes in high school teaching where we don't touch on all three because we are so content or cognitively driven, but we can see the value of adding the affective and the psychomotor.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Mshengu, you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Christine, for the meaningful presentation. I'd like to ask, I saw you spoke a lot about involving this method in practicals. Is there a reason for that? Do you think this is also can be applicable, for example, if you do it in a class setting, in lectures, for example, for modules where they do not have practicals as such?
I totally agree. We use practicals obviously because chemistry has the lovely privilege of having laboratories where we can make the learning come together. And I deliberately do it in the practical because often practicals can be quite divorced from what's happening in the lecture. So I purposefully link the practical to the lecture, and then I make the practical meaningful so that the learning which has taken place in the lecture can become meaningful. But I do feel that if you don't have practicals, the lecture is a perfect place to just tell a story. Take 30 seconds to tell a story, engage the student's heart. Even if you can't do the heart, the hands, and the head at the same time, try to engage at least 2 of the 3 prongs. So if you can engage their heart with a story or a case study, or if you can get students to do, if you engage their head and their hands, if you get them to do, for example, maybe a game related to your context, your subject. So I would say, yes, lectures can be made a place, and obviously if you've got the luxury of doing a demonstration, you could hit all 3 domains.
Thank you for that, Christine. I've got a question from Dr. Janse van Rensburg, who says that insightful presentation and such a fantastic meeting. I'm inspired. Thank you very much. So thank you for that. I don't know if anybody else has got questions that they would like to ask. Dr. Mshengo, if you could take your hand down, and then we'll just see if there's anybody else. I've got a different kind of question that I'd like to raise with you is, you know, there's some subjects that are, or some disciplines that are regarded as what we call blue sky, like, you know, pure mathematics, or to some extent, maybe even theoretical physics, where there isn't an immediate obvious link to everyday life, or how do you engage the, and I'm saying particularly the heart there, when people are doing a discipline just for its own sake?
My question would be, a counter question is a discipline ever really done just for its own sake?
Well, I think of some of the maths that's done, which is very, very abstract and so on. So that if I was asked, I would say that people are interested in it just for its intellectual stimulation, and that alone can make you, you know, engaged with the subject, not because it has an application in everyday life or not an immediate one. But eventually, you know, you find things like in maths, there was something like group theory. And nowadays, group theory is used for studying symmetry in chemistry, for example. So there is a case where it comes through.
I would suspect, like you said, that there is an inherent satisfaction, which would be the affective side, the emotional side, and people like physicists and mathematicians, there's the constant doing of examples. There's also a constant back and forth between the mathematicians and the different theories. So there are elements of the doing and the feeling already built in, but I think if you are teaching the subject at lower levels before a student can begin to get those feelings, because it's obviously a more mature student that would have that intrinsic satisfaction from the work. Before a student can get to that level of intrinsic satisfaction, I think one needs to find reasons why this is important.
Oh, thank you for that. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask? Mr. Magagula says, fantastic work, Dr. M, inspiring indeed. That's my friend Lindo Kunja Nebab. And then Dr. Masyangwako says, interesting. How can this be integrated? Now, this is a very good question, I think. How can this be integrated into a formal assessment? See what you do with that.
I like that question. Thank you for the question. So and the question forces one to look at the presentation and say, so what? If you do all of this meaningful learning in class and your assessment doesn't reflect the value and the meaningfulness, then we're negating everything that we're doing in the classroom. So assessment also has to be driven by meaningfulness. One might not be able to, again, have all three levels, but in an assessment, you might be able to contextualize a question. You might be able to ask students their opinion, backed by evidence, the evidence-based opinions. So to take, for us, I assume you're talking about from a science perspective, to take science from being completely cold and objective to allowing students that little bit of subjectivity and that little bit of context even within a test or exam.
I would go with that. I've seen assessments that are in fact embedded in a context where people have to make some critical judgments. And these days when we've got ChatGPT, who can perhaps even write our essays for it, that critical edge, I think, is what's going to be important on the assessment side. Anybody else with some questions or comments?
There was a question that says here, the issue that I find with current students is comprehension/reading of instruction. They are often looking for keywords. It is difficult in health science education where every word in the sentence is NB in the diagnosis.
Apologies, I missed that one. Yes, please go ahead and tackle that one, Christine.
Again, I think this boils down to cognitive load and maybe so when you say every word is important, yes, every word is important, but there must be important in terms of a diagnosis or important in terms of, I don't know how to answer this question. I would say that you've got an ethos in the medical sciences, this is me speaking under correction, where every word in the sentence is important in the diagnosis. Whereas one needs to be able to see context as important. If one's working in a rural farming community, if one cannot see the context, for example, animal disease and the link between animal disease and human disease, then their diagnosis and their treatment is going to lack meaningfulness. So I think one needs to expose the students to more. And we've got the power as educators, and obviously you can't be the only instructor doing this. Other instructors within your faculty need to begin to do it, to open the student's mind up to not just looking for keywords, but for looking at a broader context, because I think especially in health sciences, that is very, very important for future health and safety.
Thank you for that, Christine. I'm just looking to see if, sorry for missing that particular question. If we have no further questions, what I want to do, which I should have done right at the beginning, is welcome our director, Prof. Mukhalaka Flashman, sorry, I trip over it sometimes, and ask if she would like to welcome you, and then we'll see if there are any more questions and then close the session.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you, Christine, for the very insightful lecture. I had some of it at Saki, and I think when I listen to it again, it even makes more sense. You know, while we transform our curriculum, we should consider, you know, the student as a whole and use or consider such approaches, to making learning meaningful. And there's actually a saying that says, tell me how to do it and I will not remember, but show me, I will surely get it. So I think I can see how this can be applied also in other contexts, and I was quite happy when you said that, this can be applied right across from ECD right up until postgraduate studies. So thank you very much. I found this very useful, and I hope all the colleagues and students who are attending that they also found this helpful. And thank you, Marissa, for organizing these, and thank you for the colleagues for staying until the end. We learned very much in these lectures. We call ourselves a community of practice, and through this is the only way that we can make learning interesting and meaningful for our students. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your words. I just want to advise you that next week we've got another seminar by Professor Margaret Blackie, also a chemical educator, and she's going to be talking about creating a curriculum for knowledge building. And we're looking forward to seeing you all there. And thank you very much once again for attending. Hi, Christine. What time would you like to come back on the other link? In about half an hour?
Okay, that makes sense. That's fine.
Give you a break and then.
Yeah, so shall we say 15:15 or 20:15? What would, because we're sort of in between now.
Let's make it 20 past.
Okay.
And then we can talk. I can easily go till 2 a little bit after. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Marissa.
Okay, righto. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Mabato, for that. Thank you very much.